Hi, this is Leif Jackson here at Cybrary. Just so excited to have Karen Gibson here today. Just really excited to have you here, Karen.
Thanks, Leif. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here this morning.
Thanks for coming. Hey, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I just retired from the Army. I was in the Army for 33 years, which was 29 longer than I planned. And it's really kind of, my venturing into the cyber community was really kind of by accident, just like my Army career was almost really an accident. I joined the Army to pay for college and fell in love with it. And I served as an intelligence officer, an Army intelligence officer. And so, in the course of that, did a number of assignments off and on in the NSA cryptologic community, and NSA signals intelligence. It's really about intercepting and exploiting other people's communications. And I think if we went way back to like the Civil War, that would be, using binoculars to watch some guy on a hilltop with semaphores and flags and figuring out what he was telling his troops and then communicating that to your own boss. And, because I joined the Army so long ago, I actually, when I was a young officer in Hawaii, I had 100 folks that worked for me that were Morse code intercept operators, because those were the kinds of communications we were trying to intercept, because people actually still used it back then. And eventually, as we transitioned away from just intercepting radio signals, telephone, obviously it became digital and cyber. And then not just, how are we going to intercept and exploit that, but over time, how can we, manipulate that, attack that, block that, do things to our adversaries in cyberspace. And that was really from that military operations perspective, how I kind of ended up in the cyber community. It was very interesting and not intentional.
That's amazing. So tell me a little bit about that kind of movement from the kind of the 20th century to the 21st century, a lot of the digital native stuff that you're talking about.
Sure. So, I think it really, and perhaps it'll recur in a theme in our discussion, is that in many ways we're still applying these kind of 20th century industrial processes to the way we operate in what is now, this very 21st century digital environment. And so little things like, when I was a young officer and you would be intercepting or exploiting Soviet radio communications, you knew that whoever you stumbled across, in the frequency spectrum, that it was a military operator, probably from another country. Today, our adversaries are using exactly the same technology as my mother and my kids and every business in America. And so it really started to introduce, I think some obvious privacy concerns there. But also because there's so much money to be made, it's so lucrative now from a commercial perspective, providing digital services and digital protection, that in the 20th century, only the government still only the government has nuclear submarines, or ballistic missiles, or attack helicopters. But now we're talking about a technology that's obviously pervasive and ubiquitous, and often these Silicon Valley companies are ahead in many cases of certain government kinds of programming and acquisition. And we really need to partner more closely with Silicon Valley, I think, in trying to, and the rest of the commercial world, in trying to develop processes and solutions. I'll just give you two quick examples. One is acquisition. We are bounded by a lot of laws like the federal acquisition regulations. And when I was a new general, and they came and taught us about how that process works, and they said, from the time your requirement is validated until we start to bend metal, which is a clue right there, bend metal, it's going to be 7 years. And that's the process they work for a new attack helicopter, a joint strike fighter. We're going to have a new kind of naval destroyer. It's a very complicated and long process. And initially, they were trying to apply those same kind of processes to developing digital tools. And if it was an offensive tool, they'd say, well, that's something we're going to use to attack an enemy. It's a weapon. So we're going to apply the same weapon system acquisition programs to a digital tool, and that just doesn't work. A second example I'll use is training. My background is Army. I am proud of the fact that the Army is shifting and becoming more agile, but we still have very 20th century training models. And, my husband, who's even older than I am, when he was a light infantryman, which was, you jump out of an airplane or you walk everywhere you go, the most significant equipment upgrade he ever experienced was a new kind of parachute or the transition from the M16A1 to the M16A2 rifle. And so for a guy whose equipment doesn't really change, whose technology is never really significantly modified, you can go to the officer's basic course when you first join the Army. 4 years later, you go to the captain's course. When you're a major at the 10-year mark, you'll go to Fort Leavenworth. And if you're really good, you'll go to the War College as a colonel. And that suffices. But to be a digital warrior is, as a commitment to continual lifetime training. And a lot of our models that are built around folks that drive tanks or drive ships or, fly fighters lack that kind of agility and flexibility. And so I think we really need to change many of the processes that we rely on for fielding capabilities in the military cyberspace. We're making progress, but there's still some way to go.
Wow, that is fascinating. If I'm like a company out there, like a Silicon Valley company that's working with the government, for example, how would you recommend this kind of partnership to happen?
Well, we've got we've built organizations like DIU. It started as DIUX, which is the Defense Innovation Unit out in Silicon Valley to identify those kinds of companies that are working on promising technologies. And it's now beyond just cyber. We also look closely at space and other things. So the military started putting folks out literally in Silicon Valley to work that kind of partnership more closely, identify those promising technologies and get those integrated. There are some other things. The Army has stood up an Army Futures Command, which is oriented at identifying the kinds of technologies that we'll need with the express purpose of bringing those on board and integrating those more rapidly than we are right now. And they have some close partnerships. They're out in Texas, in Austin, to bring those kinds of things on board more quickly, because that's a big technology hub. And I think in some of the places where we have key cyber elements, like Fort Meade and up in Central Maryland and Augusta, Georgia, Fort Gordon, and then also San Antonio, Texas. The Air Force has a big hub there. We are building partnerships with the local educational community, with local businesses to kind of create these cyber hubs that will help us meet the needs of our military cyber requirements. And it also, in many cases, provides some very exciting career opportunities, I think, in places that weren't previously so tech focused, like perhaps Augusta, Georgia. And then we partner closely with local universities, usually, like Georgia Tech in Atlanta. University of Maryland, Baltimore College has a great partnership program with the National Security Agency and some others to kind of build those partnerships between academia, industry, and the Department of Defense or for our national security needs. So back to your original question, what would you do if you were a small business that was working on these kind of things? There are typically some associations or organizations in each of those locations that are heavily invested in developing those kind of partnerships. There are professional associations that are very engaged in trying to build productive partnerships between the private sector and the military. And I think at the end of the day, it feels like there just aren't enough cyber qualified STEM type folks who are pursuing careers like that in America. So we really try to encourage those kinds of education, career, and training opportunities to meet both personal and defense needs.
Yeah, that makes sense, Karen. I mean, the skills gap is real, right? I mean, 25% of jobs are just constantly open at all times, and that keeps growing in the cyber field. So it's certainly an area for career development as well as just a strong employment area overall. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that we touched on a bit earlier was not just the kind of the training side and the partnership side, but you even mentioned that on the vulnerabilities and attack side, that you're seeing more from uh, both the international side, but like more on the domestic side, and how these partnerships can actually help with those vulnerabilities. Can you talk a little bit about the structure there and kind of what you're seeing?
Yeah. So, as a military professional, I spent my career very focused on foreign adversaries and conducting operations overseas. I was looking at, and most of my time was spent focused on or deployed to the Middle East. So, trying to defeat ISIS. Fortunately, we did. Working on the ISIS campaign, looking at Iranian missiles, Pakistani nuclear doctrine. And when I came back to the United States and I moved to the Washington, D.C. area in 2018, I was assigned to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. It was very eye-opening for me. It was a real epiphany because I'd been so focused for a long time on those foreign threats that occur in foreign places. And I'd been looking at adversaries overseas. It was eye-opening to me to understand the wealth of domestic threats that we face, particularly in cyberspace. I think a couple of things, one, those who wish to do us harm as a nation have ample opportunities to do so in cyber, whether that's to erode our decisive advantages, intellectual property theft, economic espionage, degrade our economic might, weaken our faith in the American system of government, as we see with some of the election meddling, particularly by Russia, that the oceans that protected us from other kinds of threats are obviously no barrier at all to adversaries who want to impact us from cyberspace. And in another area, I think, when we think about major operations, major contingencies, major war, I would hope we would never go to war with China. But in a major war, we're naive if we think that the homeland is going to go unscathed in that kind of conflict. We've always thought of war as something that happens over there, but that's no longer the case. We are no longer protected from attacks from other places. And anyone who works in cybersecurity knows that well, but I don't think we always think about the vulnerabilities of critical infrastructure. I would hope that the pandemic and kind of what we're going through now, seeing how, just a germ that did in fact originate, on another continent, what that does to our economy, to our national security, to our society, our very way of life. Just imagine a major cyber attack against, our electrical distribution system, against ATMs, against the New York Stock Exchange, or the banking industry, or our ability to communicate with one another. Can you imagine if we didn't have Zoom in this pandemic? And so I think that it was very eye-opening to me to consider these domestic vulnerabilities and the fact that these are all here in the United States, to be focused now internally, not just externally. And I think a real challenge here is that most of that critical infrastructure, 90% of it, I think, is in the hands of the private sector. So it's not something that the government can protect in quite the same way as we do, say, for instance, our airspace or, the naval approaches to the United States. And so it really calls for a much stronger partnership and awareness with the private sector to keep that critical infrastructure safe.
That makes sense. I mean, you talk about the electric power grid. You talk about, obviously, during 9/11 when the financial markets collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot that even hasn't been done. I mean, poisoning the Mississippi River could be one, right?
Yeah, let's not give people ideas. Let's not be planting. Don't be coming up with evil genius kind of stuff, because I think there's a lot of things that could be done, and that really, so one of my big soapboxes of the last year. It's kind of ironic for someone who's been focused on terrorists overseas, but I do believe we're now overinvested in the counterterror fight. We put in place, we built the TSA, the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, where I used to work, was created. All of that in the wake of 9/11, because we recognized that as a nation, we had done a poor job of connecting the dots and protecting ourselves against foreign terrorists who sought to do us harm. And that threat, well, we can't discount it. And it's always tragic when there's a loss of life, like there was in Pensacola back in December with the Saudi pilot who shot 4 sailors. That's no longer the most likely threat against the United States, nor is it the most dangerous. So if we think, in my, parlance where I come from as a military intelligence officer, we often characterize adversary activities, at least at a tactical level, as most likely and most dangerous. And I know there are people who don't like that construct because they say, hey, our enemies can do more than 2 things. And if you just look at those, you have a tendency to perhaps ignore and not get ready to counter some of those middle moderate kind of actions. But if we think about it for this morning on most likely and most dangerous, I say the most likely enemy course of action is clearly cyber, because it happens every single day, right? Penetrating our networks, stealing information, planting disinformation. So the most likely enemy course of action is not radical Sunni jihadists. It's something in cyber. And if we think about the most dangerous, as appalling as the 9/11 attacks were, and that loss of life, and the destruction of, the Twin Towers in New York City, that kind of would pale compared to shutting down electricity in the United States, cutting electricity to hospitals, old people on respirators, babies in incubators, just look at what COVID has done. And so imagine what could be done with a very destructive attack against our cyber infrastructure or our critical infrastructure. So I believe that both the most likely and the most dangerous attacks against the U.S. would occur in cyberspace. And I would advocate that we need to think about, as a government, how do we take the lessons learned and institutional processes that have allowed us to successfully prevent another major terrorist attack since 9/11. How do we reorient that and take those same kinds of government sharing processes and put them in place for cyber, not just terrorists?
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. The power grid did go down in New York and Canada at one point. You saw what a difference that made, right? One of the pieces that we discussed earlier that I think our audience would find so fascinating is when you stood up a security operations center. So we have a lot of people doing that on our platform. And just tell me about that and lessons learned and those kinds of things.
Yeah, so mine was a little different. It was, we called it the Joint Force Headquarters for Cyber. And what made it different was we were conducting military operations in cyberspace, both offensive and defensive. And so I think it's in part that offensive component that's quite different. And really, taking military operations, intelligence, operations, and fires, which is striking or attacking someone, and standing up an ops center that would do all of that in cyberspace to support our military operations. So, from a defensive perspective, because I came to it as a military professional, and working with military defenders and applying the same kind of operational doctrine and terminology. So, on the ground, I'm in the Army, on the ground, we look at terrain and we say, okay, what do I need to defend? What's my critical infrastructure? What's the key terrain that I got to defend? How is my enemy going to come at me? We call those the avenues of approach. What are the most likely ways that he's going to come? What kind of obstacles can I put out to block him? And by the way, if he's going to be slowed at an obstacle, I want some kind of, in the real world or in, the terrestrial world, I want fires. I need to observe him there. What kind of surveillance am I going to put out? We conduct cyber surveillance or ISR to defend that key terrain, and really kind of applying those same principles there. And then integrating that with the offensive piece. And it was kind of the first time we brought those two communities together. The offensive piece kind of grew largely out of military intelligence, because back to that early cryptologic thing I talked about, where we collect and exploit people's communications. Now we're finding ways to disrupt or, thwart their communications. And then the defense side, which came out of our communications, our signal regiment, our IT professionals, and kind of merging those communities to build one solid 24/7 ops center that could both attack and defend in cyberspace. And it was tough. It was, a couple of things. One, I find that the technology is usually not the hard part. The technology just seems impossible until you've figured it out. The long pole in the tent, the hardest part, is policy and culture, and getting those to change. Policy, culture, and authorities. That was tough. It's not usually the technology that is the hardest part.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that? Like,
sure.
The change in the culture, the policies.
Yeah. So I think, some of the toughest was on the offensive side, frankly, because if you're going to attack someone else's infrastructure, perhaps it's something that NSA is getting a lot of value out of collecting against. So you have to have what's called an IGL discussion, intel gain loss. Is what I'm going to gain by destroying or preventing this kind of communication, is it worth what I'm going to give up from an intelligence perspective? And we actually, again, go through the same thing in the real world terrain. If I want to blow up a public switch telephone network that ISIS is using, is it worth what NSA will give up for having collected against it? If you ever saw the movie The Imitation Game, it was about Alan Turing and the Enigma machine that they developed to crack Nazi communications. Benedict Cumberbatch, Kyra Knightley, a couple of years ago. Anyway, there's a part where they intercept and understand that the Nazis are going to attack a British convoy. And they decide not to tell the convoy, because by doing that, they'll be giving away to Germany that we've cracked their code. So those kind of intel gain loss discussions have always gone on. And we did a lot of arm wrestling with NSA on that. My first year in standing up this ops center, I came to work for the first 12 months and said, my mission is to defeat ISIS in cyberspace. The second year I came to work and I said, my job is to defeat the NSA bureaucracy, because I felt like they were standing in my way at every turn. It was really something that we had to negotiate with them. We had to negotiate with other parts of the government too. So, again, it's not the technology usually, it's usually the authorities, the policy, and the culture. So say, for instance, I'm trying to disrupt ISIS propaganda efforts. And we have laws that say you're allowed to attack things in this area of hostilities, Iraq and Syria. Well, what do you do if that server's in Iceland? That's not in the area of hostilities. So now you have to negotiate probably with the Department of State. And you have to talk about, well, are we going to inform the Icelandic government, or are we just going to, do you even have the authority to do that? I'll give you another example, and this is kind of skipping around, but on the authorities piece, you can take a soldier and give him, an M4 rifle and put him on a gate somewhere in an overseas post, and he's authorized to use deadly force. He can make a decision to take a human life. But in the early days of cyber, if you wanted to send a Formula 404 error, when someone hit a website, that required the president's approval. That was like back in 2012. It was just seemed ridiculously disproportionate. So we had to work through a lot of those kinds of getting authorities changed so that we could conduct operations. And, perhaps those don't really pertain to your folks that are running SOCs. But we encountered, I think, more bureaucratic and policy obstacles than we actually encountered technical obstacles. And so I think really a lot of that, it all comes down to trust. There was a lot of nervousness about how we conduct operations in cyber, and do we trust each other? Do we have trust within different parts of the government? And are our allies and partners going to trust us? And so in working through those kind of things with the CIA and NSA and Department of State, and even, the Department of Defense and others, I think a lot of it had to do with building trust so that we could trust one another's intentions. And so they'd know, we weren't cowboys out there that were going to muck everything up for them. A lot of it is understanding equities. Why is this other person concerned about my operations? So that you can, as you're laying out what you want to do, you can kind of assuage their concerns. It's a lot harder to do that if you don't understand why they object to what you're trying to do. And then I think really the third thing on building that trust is you got to work together regularly all the time. You can't wait till there's a crisis to try to establish a trusting relationship. You have to do it all the time. So that there's when you come to that crisis, that there is that level of trust and understanding that they can rely on what you're doing. I think one other example I would offer that pertains from, translates from military operations into, doing kind of civilian defensive cyber defense is information sharing. And that was also kind of an epiphany to me to come to the national level and to work with domestic agencies and to find that they didn't always have the same incentives to share that we necessarily had in the military. So, when I was the director of intelligence for the Defeat ISIS campaign in Iraq and Syria, and we had a great information sharing network. And as soon as something popped up in one area, every other, intel hub would be informed of it. And we were sharing our information very broadly. It was none of this knowledge is power. I got a secret. I'm going to hold this over you, or, this is going to make me look good if I'm the only one that knows it. You got to do away with that environment where everyone is sharing information and you are all benefiting. And it was tremendously powerful. When I came back to the States and I started working some of this domestic stuff, particularly with certain industries, again, this gets back to learning about another industry's equities. Say, for instance, we were working with the aviation field on, what are your vulnerabilities in cyberspace? I'd come from an environment where we all shared this stuff all the time. I wasn't thinking about how commercial vulnerabilities can translate to advantage to your competitors, or, can dent your stock prices if the public finds out that you have a major vulnerability. I wasn't aware that these are some of the kinds of things that can prevent or slow down information sharing. Another example would be law enforcement community. I thought, hey, we're all going to share all this information. I didn't understand that within the law enforcement community, report cards that are perhaps given based on convictions and not wanting to share information. You see it in the movies all the time, the feds are in town, this is my case or whatever. I didn't really understand how real that was until I began to work with the law enforcement community on information sharing. And I know this is a long answer to your question, but the last one I'd mention is, I think the ISACs, the information sharing analysis centers that have sprung up, that are built around, I should say, not sprung up, around different kinds of industries, aviation, water, maritime, restaurant, hotel, et cetera. The financial sector has an ISAC. Those are really powerful when there is information sharing on commercial threats, on cyber threats to various commercial industries. And that kind of information sharing is absolutely what we got to do.
I love it. I love how you walk through all the different incentives that people have and how it disincentivizes information sharing or incentivizes it, right? So how do you actually think through the actual incentivization? That makes a lot of sense.
I think you have to understand other people's equities. You have to understand why they're reluctant to share before you can kind of get to a place where you are more willing to share.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Just as a final thought for our audience, we'd love to hear from you. And before I forget, thank you for your service to our country. Really appreciate it across the board. So, any final thoughts?
I want to thank everybody who's involved in cybersecurity, because like I said, I used to worry a lot about terrorists, particularly now that I'm not in the military. I don't think about it nearly as much, even though they still make me take my shoes off every time I go to the airport. We need that same kind of vigilance in the cyber domain. And so I appreciate everybody who is involved in keeping networks secure, whether that's military networks or whether that's the commercial sector, because frankly, these are, I think, some of the most critical vulnerabilities in America, and it's essential to our national security. And I don't think people always think about that. They think, the military are the ones that are keeping America safe, certainly from other foreign military attacks. But when you consider the American economy as the foundation for our whole national security, I think that cybersecurity expertise and cybersecurity experts are really unsung heroes. So I'd like to think.